Welcome to the final panel in today's session. We'll be looking at the Belt and Road Initiative. During this session, both Scott Morris from the Center of Global Development, as well as Jamie Horsley from Brookings, as well as Yale University, will ask the respective questions of what are the implications of the Belt and Road Initiative, China's platform for infrastructure financing globally. What are the implications both from a debt perspective as well as a governance perspective? So without any further ado, I present Scott Morris.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Fair warning, I do not bring the econometric chops from our prior sessions, so you're going to get a slightly different presentation. Still some data on the slides, but I do want to review some of the work we've done at the Center for Global Development, assessing debt risks associated with Belt and Road, provide some updates on that from other sources that I think are pretty compelling. I do hope to leave time at the end, since this is a U.S.-China conference, to talk about, from a policy perspective, how the U.S. government is seeking to respond to Belt and Road and more broadly to Chinese cross-border finance. Okay, there we go. So let me start with the study that we did at the Center for Global Development now well over a year ago. And you have to do some work to interpret this, but I'll help you in a minute. We did what I would say, and I'm not going to beat myself up about it, but frankly was a fairly modest exercise and one that nonetheless got a fair amount of attention. I think because it was the first time someone tried to assess debt risk from the developing country borrower perspective across the Belt and Road countries. And essentially what we did was took the countries that were defined at the time under Belt and Road, looked at their current debt profiles, and there are a lot of sort of standard, fairly well understood and transparent measures of that from various sources. And then the real work of what we did was try to build in a pipeline of Belt and Road projects using whatever sources were available, and then just do some simple math, attaching those projects to the current debt profile of the countries. So this really is a summary of that work, focusing on the countries that we identified as either a particular risk of debt distress as under Belt and Road, or at some significant risk, if not sort of high risk. And the way to understand this is, if we're looking horizontally, this is sort of an overall measure of debt for these countries. And then following the arrows in the chart is the effect of adding these Belt and Road projects. So to the degree the countries are moving to the right, their overall debt burden is growing by that much under the initiative. And then vertically, this is a measure of concentration in that debt with China as creditor. And arguably, that's as much of the story here, because when you look sort of this middle to upper tier of these countries that are viewed as either at significant or high risk of debt distress, what you see is really an extraordinary position for China as a creditor to these governments. I should say that we were only looking at government lending, official lending from China, and government borrowing on the borrowing side. And you have the very extreme case of a country like Djibouti, where essentially Djibouti's only external creditor today is official Chinese finance, the Chinese government. But frankly, it is striking the degree to which you have a large number of these countries where China, as a share of their external credits, is 30% and more, and that really is striking, and it's hard to identify comparators for that. I'll talk a bit more about multilateral institutions and their role in lending. Certainly historically, if we think about an institution like the World Bank, in very low-income countries, it has probably played that kind of role. But certainly for a bilateral government lender like China, this is striking. So I think since then, official sources like the IMF, and this is what I am identifying here, and then some other academic work has sort of filled out the picture more. And this reinforces what is the striking and emerging role of China, particularly in countries that we would identify as high risk. So if we look on the left, you have the universe of low-income countries as the IMF defines them, and we sort of had 3 moments in time looking at who are their creditors. And within that picture, we see China as the gray bar. It certainly has grown quite a lot, but is not the largest creditor. Now, these other groups are categories of creditors. And for example, if we're comparing China to the Paris Club is this group of official creditors. It's a lot of creditors. It's the G7 countries, it's Japan, among quite a few others. So in a sense, it's already striking that China is larger than all of these creditors combined, but still falls well below the multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the regional development banks. Far more striking is if you look at a subgroup of countries, the countries, again, that whether we or the IMF defines it at high debt risk, they already have debt burdens that suggest that it is not sustainable for them. That is where China really emerges in a striking way as the dominant creditor. So again, consistent with our study, but using data from the IMF. More recently, I like to highlight this paper that came out, I believe this summer. It was published as an NBR paper. Before that, a Kiel Institute working paper by Horn, Reinhardt, and Trebesh. There's a lot in what they did, but essentially they tried to pull all data sources that are out there, trying to identify China's overseas lending, as they call it, and create a more comprehensive picture than what we've had to date. And I pulled out two charts from their study that are particularly striking to me in telling a couple parts of the story. On the left, what you see is their estimate of that China as creditor for the top 50 borrowing countries, and particularly striking, and really the headline of their study is the degree to which they call this hidden debt, in the sense that it isn't officially reported, particularly to the multilateral institutions, through sort of well understood and used reporting systems that creditors, there is some expectation that borrowers and creditors would report debt through these, and they identify this very significant share of Chinese lending that is not reported through those mechanisms. A different issue here on the right is, if we again think of this issue of China is lending a lot in the developing world generally, still not the dominant creditor, but then in these higher risk situations, very clearly the dominant creditor. Another feature of that is a sort of a clue as to how China manages these risks for the borrowing countries. Namely, they restructure and forgive debt. And at a much higher rate than what we see from certainly other official creditors. And the point of this slide, which is comparing China in red in terms of restructurings and write-offs to private creditors, their point in the paper is that China is playing more of the role that private creditors had to play historically in earlier periods of debt distress. But in my mind, what is striking about this very high rate of these restructurings is, again, if we think of, if we look at the Paris Club of Creditors, which again is G7 countries, France, Germany, US, Japan, there is nothing like this degree of activity when it comes to restructuring. And of course, China is not a member of the Paris Club, so when we see these restructuring actions, they are a bilateral activity. It is a decision that China makes in some sort of negotiation with the borrowing country, not in coordination with other creditors through the Paris Club. I'm going to spend a minute on the case of a railway investment in Laos because I did a case study on this earlier in the year, and I do think it's a fairly striking example of how China manages, frankly, debt risks in pursuing Belt and Road investments. And let's keep in mind, so this is a railway, nearly $6 billion investment. Belt and Road entails very large infrastructure projects with big price tags associated with them. That is a big challenge in a lot of these countries. And certainly Laos, which was on our earlier slide, is a high debt risk country, is a striking example of that. Let me just jump ahead briefly. If we look at Laos's current debt profile and look at the trajectory over time, you see very rapid growth in external debt stock to bilaterals. And while this data source, which is, I think is the World Bank source at identifying China, I think the evidence suggests that it is China driving that growth, whereas other sources, although private creditors actually have come in significantly, but the multilateral institutions are behaving, frankly, as we expect they would behave, in that as the debt risks have grown, they've adjusted their approach and are not lending as much. But the key point, before I leave Laos behind, is in some ways the structure of this investment does show an official China that is, in a sense, sensitive to the debt risk, or at least thinking of its role as a creditor. And essentially what they've done is created a joint venture and pursued this through a very large equity stake. So China has a majority control of this railway within Laos, because frankly, even for China, it's hard to imagine how they would pursue it any other way with this price tag. The government of Laos simply wouldn't have a way to borrow for a project of this size. And as it is, there is a China Exim Bank loan to support the Laos government's equity stake in the railway that itself suggests some debt sustainability problems. I'm going to skip that. Let me focus a minute on the policy implications of all of these debt risks. So with the most recent Belt and Road Forum in the spring, the Chinese government, the Ministry of Finance in particular, specifically, announced that they have created a debt sustainability framework for the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at the text of this framework, it is virtually identical to what we know well as the IMF World Bank debt sustainability framework. Some greet that as good news, a sign of sort of growing interest and sensitivity on the part of the Chinese government to be careful about lending and sensitive to the borrowing capacity of countries. I frankly have a more skeptical, even negative take about this exercise. First of all, there's a lot of emphasis, and I would say in my own conversations with Chinese officials, I hear the word voluntary a lot. Now, to be fair, in a sense, the bank fund framework, there isn't necessarily a lot of teeth behind it, but this emphasis on voluntary, including for thinking about Chinese-owned lending institutions, it's not clear at all that there's any mechanism or enforcement within the Chinese government, namely that the finance ministry does not seem to have any real reach into these lending institutions in applying this debt sustainability framework. This framework, the IMF World Bank framework, depends critically on assumptions. So namely, assumptions around economic growth, projections. And it's going to depend a lot on what the framework says in terms of outcomes based on what you put in, garbage in, garbage out. Now, that's not to say we're talking about manipulated data, but again, there's a lot of room for assumptions around projections. And as a result, it's not at all implausible that a Belt and Road debt sustainability framework is going to generate a different result than an IMF World Bank framework, which leads to, I think, the fundamental problem with this exercise is that it I think, inevitably will lead to conflict. Far more impressive to me, and frankly, it would have been quite surprising, is if the Chinese government were to announce that they were going to tie the decisions of their official lenders to the IMF World Bank framework, at least show greater sensitivity to the risk ratings that those institutions assign to countries. I think what we're seeing with this is, frankly, a more direct effort to appeal to sort of the PR aspects of the concerns around debt sustainability, but a pretty clear signal at the same time that they really aren't serious at this stage about disciplining their official lenders. Just to spend a minute on this, because I've focused exclusively on debt issues, there are a wide array of other issues that come with particularly large infrastructure projects. Certainly in the official sector and in multilateral institutions, the World Bank is sort of the flagship institution, but even increasingly among private lenders that seek to address an array of project risks, whether it is how procurement is done for the project, how environmental impact is assessed, how impact on local communities assessed. You see a pretty robust, some would say onerous, set of standards that have developed among the key multilateral lenders. And it's useful to look at how China's lenders compare in that respect. So we did a basic comparison starting with the World Bank, including the AIIB, but then also key bilateral aid agencies and development finance institutions like AFD, JBIC. And what you see is actually among some of those leading bilateral DFIs, they have aligned themselves pretty strongly with the World Bank approach. AIIB certainly has as well, but China Exim and China Development Bank largely have not. I think any assessment trying to understand their approach to these sort of key areas suggests that there's a long way to go for these institutions if they want to be viewed sort of as peer institution to these other major official lenders. The U.S. response. So my last 5 minutes, good. So I will say I appreciate the spirit of where the U.S. government is on these issues and particularly my old colleagues in the U.S. Treasury, I think are engaged in a serious exercise of being specific about the problems they see with the Belt and Road Initiative. I think a lot of it consistent with things that I've said here. But frankly, that work is happening within a larger messaging that I have a lot of problems with. And it is broadly framed around competition with China around this set of development finance activities. Frankly, this is the kind of activity in other countries that the U.S. is out of practice in. We've really gotten away from this because of past debt crises where we found ourselves forgiving a lot of low-income country debt. We decided that it really wasn't a great approach to engaging, and we shifted more of our focus exclusively to traditional aid through big initiatives like PEPFAR, focused on global health, humanitarian assistance. And we really tended to de-emphasize lending to other governments, certainly, as a mode of engagement. I think that is changing in intention, and if not reality. But we've seen a tremendous amount of attention to the set of changes to OPIC, the existing development finance institution for the United States, which is quite a small agency. And the big change, the primary change to OPIC is to make it bigger. So an institution that has the ability to lend about $20 billion in total, so all outstanding lending activities, has now increased to $60 billion in total. U.S. agency to double Africa spending. Now, it's important to look through those numbers and focus on it sort of as a reality check. That $60 billion, again, is all outstanding loans they have the ability to take on, compared to it's actually $29 billion today. Of the $29 billion, OPIC is currently at about $20 billion. So they're not even at their existing cap, let alone this new cap. Translate that into annual commitments, and they're an agency that's doing about $3.5 billion a year. They want to double commitments to Africa. Africa is currently about $825 million a year. This is not an institution that's going to compete directly with Chinese official finance. Also striking to me much more recently is the announcement of what is a very large investment for OPIC in a toll road in Argentina. So interesting because it's Argentina. This is not an approach, the traditional approach to aid on the part of the U.S. It really is a signal that the U.S. is prepared to go into much higher income country markets. And it is a toll road. And I would say it is striking that they found this investment because it's probably one of the few examples where an agency like OPIC can go head-to-head with the Chinese. It's very hard as the model of OPIC is as a private lender, it's going to lend to private actors. Well, it's hard to find private actors who are going to do big public infrastructure projects. And the only place you're going to find them are things like toll roads. So I think it was revealing that they went forward with this. I will say it's not entirely consistent with what Congress said about the future of OPIC, that they actually said they wanted this agency to be focused on the poorest countries, not Argentina. Just in summing up, let me sort of offer another way of thinking about the U.S. approach and particularly responding to China is that you have this clear tension between a bilateral approach and multilateral. We heard a discussion earlier about the trade conflict. It's very much sort of the same themes here, is that the deficiencies of taking a purely bilateral approach and turning your back on multilateral mechanisms as a way to responding to legitimate concerns you would have with China's behavior. So within the bilateral channel, again, we see this emphasis on competition over cooperation with China when it comes to financing in third countries. And that is a very real shift. That was not the approach of the Obama administration when it came to the development and aid agenda. On the other hand, it may generate more money overall for U.S. development assistance. That remains to be seen. Each year, the administration puts forward a budget that slashes traditional aid. It is a much more transactional approach to aid over objectives that are defined around eradication of disease or responding to disasters. This is much more, you're in our camp or you're in China's camp, and we will reward you if you're in our camp. That carries a lot of problems. Finally, on the multilateral side, I should say, I don't want to distort this administration's track record. While within the UN system it's been horrible, they've actually been relatively, let's say, benign when it comes to the multilateral development banks. They've supported now 2 capital increases at the World Bank and the African Development Bank. Overall, I haven't seen them as terribly disruptive actors within that system. Earlier this week, and this will be my last comment, we see the announcement of something called the Blue Dot Network, invoking Carl Sagan, which is an interesting choice. I don't know what inspired that exactly, but it's supposed to be an alliance with Japan and Australia to pursue some approach, still remain to be defined, around helping countries achieve high infrastructure standards with a very heavy dose of, again, counteracting China's role in these countries. This is mini multilateralism. I have some problems with this approach in contrast to thinking about the much broader role that core multilateral institutions play. I think at the end of the day, my worry is that the blue dot will actually be a blue speck when it comes to addressing this set of challenges. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
So hi there, I'm Jamie Horsley. I'm with Yale Law Schools. I'm a lawyer by training and also visiting fellow at Brookings. And my work with China over the last 15 years has been more looking at domestic developments within China from a governance perspective. And so when I was asked to participate in a conference 2 summers ago, of course, all the Chinese organizers wanted us to address Belt and Road in some fashion. So I thought I would take a look at it from the perspective of the criticism coming out of a lot of international observers that Belt and Road was yet another device through which China was going to try and export not only goods and services and infrastructure, but their authoritarian model and see what that sort of meant. So we all know BRI has a lot of very nice sounding goals and promising equal consultation and cooperation, et cetera. And I love the building a community of a shared future for mankind. And in fact, it involves a lot of initiatives other than just building infrastructure, but that is the main focus of a lot of issues and complaints about BRI, and ties into my issues with the governance issues, because that's where they arise. And it struck me that a lot of what China's running into overseas is exactly what they've had to deal with at home in their own development process. Infrastructure is very complicated. And poor governance is a major reason why a lot of infrastructure projects fail to meet their time frame, budget, and other delivery goals. And in fact, that could lead to suspension, renegotiation, or even cancellation of projects, as we've seen at China at home as well. So what are the governance concerns? A big one is fiscal sustainability, which we've just heard about, the whole debt trap issue, predatory lending, et cetera. And part of that's a lack of open and competitive procurement, so that we see Chinese companies getting most of the contracts to build the infrastructure overseas, not applying even Chinese, let alone internationally accepted environmental and social standards in the projects, almost a virtual total absence of any discussion of the importance of local stakeholder participation and voice. And this has often led to local oppositions to Chinese projects at home, but also overseas in their investments. And I'm not going to really address, but it's somewhat related to the whole idea of local job creation and the issue of labor influx with all the Chinese workers being brought overseas to build these projects, et cetera. Huge problem is the general lack of transparency about BRI, not only on the finance side, which is quite striking, but overall. Even though President Xi, Party Secretary Xi, claims it's a very transparent initiative, it really isn't. And then running throughout all of this, of course, are corruption issues. So when I stepped back and I started looking first as a lawyer, I started reading, well, what are the documents? What are the rules, the regulations, the policy documents, and how have they developed over time? And I went back because, of course, BRI was preceded by another policy starting around '99 of the Chinese going out initiative, the Zhou and so that's when they started doing a lot of it. And it really struck me that one big problem is BRI is not institutionalized. You know, we heard in the first couple years this is a top-down, you know, centrally driven, you know, geostrategic kind of initiative. And it might have been in its vision, but in the way it's being carried out, it seems to me it's really more of a mess. No one is really in charge on a day-to-day, project-by-project basis. So they did found, you know, the leaders, a leadership small group, which is, you know, normally under the State Council, but it's led by Vice Premier Han Zheng, who's also a member of the party Politburo. The office is set in the National Development Reform Commission, the Fagai Way, and everybody who works with China knows they're very important because they're the kind of coordinating people. They're in charge of public-private partnerships, domestic investment, et cetera. So they run the office and are nominally in charge. They're on a lot of these documents and policies that are initiated. And then you have provincial, municipal level BRI leadership groups too. And this has become a very entrepreneurial kind of initiative. In terms of regulators or people setting policy, I said the NDRC, commerce, as you might suspect, they are very much involved. Finance is, and they're very important to the debt side because it's clear Ministry of Finance started getting really concerned about China's overseas debt exposure back in around 2016. But they do not apparently supervise or have much of a voice about the policy banks, which are under the State Council. So the policy banks, China Development, China Exim, are very important players, as we heard from Scott and others. There's also some sovereign funds set up for BRI. The big four state-owned banks are pretty much involved, and even some of the multilateral development banks are involved. Another lack of institutionalization is no overarching law or framework at all about how this initiative is supposed to work. It was announced by Xi in a couple talks in 2013. 2 years later, we get this big vision and action paper about what BRI should be. It was co-issued by NDRC Commerce and Foreign Affairs. And then there have been a lot of other plans and action documents issued, standards, maritime cooperation, agricultural cooperation, energy, a lot on environment, but they didn't start focusing on green BRI till 2017 in response to a lot of complaints. And then financing principles, 2019, they just had their second Belt and Road Forum in April, and they announced this debt sustainability framework at that time, and also, finally, an anti-corruption initiative. Meanwhile, the National Government of Commerce has issued a lot of regulations governing overseas foreign contracting, overseas investment, labor services, et cetera. But when it comes to BRI specifically, there's no law or regulation. It's all these policy documents which are not binding. They're sort of encouraging folks to do stuff. The other thing is internationally, of course, BRI is not institutionalized also. Unlike WTO, there's no overarching multilateral agreement. It's been developed mostly through bilateral memos of understanding, most of which are not publicly available. They're listed, but you can't see what they say. The latest count is there are 197 of these MOUs or cooperative documents involving 137 countries and 30 international organizations. And then there are a lot of additional documents about a whole range of other initiatives. I mean, it's impossible to keep track of it. The Chinese refer to BRI as a platform, and it's just a networked, multi-actor, multi-level sort of initiative with a lot of people all the way down to local governments in the act, and a lot of Chinese companies running around overseas trying to develop projects. Of course, China has signed on to some international law covenants and stuff, and they're somewhat relevant, but very hard to enforce. So now the leadership has realized, all the blowback from all the problems that we've encountered overseas and have started realizing they might have to develop a more high-quality BRI approach. So I'll move on. What are some of the things we're looking at? So we talked open government procurement. Most of it goes to Chinese companies. The EU has refused to sign on officially to, and other than Italy, none of the countries there have signed on either until China starts getting an open and competitive procurement process. Actually, at home, China has done that. They've got a competitive one. They do e-procurement. Has not been open to foreign competition, although they've promised they'll make it open to foreign investment enterprises. Public participation, this bit about local engagement. China's realized at home that this is pretty critical to getting projects accepted and work successfully at home. They do have national laws and regulations mandating public participation in major project decisions and in environmental impact assessments. Very hard to carry off. They don't always do it. But the point is that shows the leadership gets it, that public participation, local engagement is very important to project success. As recently as last July, everybody's focused on Hong Kong, but there was a huge demonstration in Wuhan that led to project cancellation, a garbage incinerator of some sort, over 10,000 people, and it had to just be canceled or at least suspended for the time being. Transparency, again, very important. This is a very opaque thing. We don't even know what a BRI project is, or even a BRI country, really. There's been no definition about any of this. There are no standards about what is a BRI project. But at home, China's developed a pretty respectable transparency regime. Government disclosure has to be proactively disclosed. You can request information. Come to major infrastructure projects, construction contracts, bidding documents, financing, all of that has to be publicly available. And in fact, are available up on websites as well. But a lot of those laws and policies, some of them even specifically say they do not apply to infrastructure projects overseas. Why? Then we come to the anti-corruption problem too. And of course at home, she's been addressing the corruption issue vigorously with this ongoing campaign. He's even created a whole new branch of government called the National Supervision Commission to deal with it. It's run by the party. China also participates in a lot of international anti-corruption efforts. They have joined the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, taken the lead in APEC and other areas. One of their main concerns internationally is to get cooperation to bring back all those fugitives who have absconded overseas and get their assets returned too. But increasingly, the party realizes they have a huge corruption problem overseas as well in the BRI. And then, as I said, I reviewed all these documents starting back, and what I found was that, again, from the regulatory authorities' point of view, there's been a steep learning curve about all the problems there are, and increasingly, whereas China's initial reaction is, look, companies go overseas, our laws don't apply, we don't interfere in local affairs, companies, you have to obey the local law. Even if in the local countries they have weak, domestic enforcement, et cetera, it's not our problem, you do what you do overseas. This is Xi Jinping's signature initiative now, which has become almost synonymous with Chinese foreign policy. And so in a way, you would think the leadership should get that they can't really ignore all these problems they're creating overseas. So now there's more emphasis on focusing on fiscal, environmental, social integrity, meaning corruption and other risk factors. Risk is a big part of the language. Use local professionals, build up compliance, corporate compliance mechanisms, et cetera, and obey not only local law, but also Chinese law, international best practices even, and especially when their local law is underdeveloped. So at this recent BRI forum, they announced what they've been developing over the last few months, a high standard BRI, which is to be open, by which they mean inclusive and voluntary, not transparent. Sustainable BRI, again, focusing on economic, social, fiscal, et cetera. Green BRI, a lot of initiatives on that. People-centered, by which they're focusing on priority and poverty alleviation and jobs. But again, no references to local engagement. And a clean Silk Road. So what are these goals and what is exactly happening on it? The fiscal sustainability, again, they adopted this non-mandatory debt sustainability framework, which looks pretty good. Actually, from watching again the documents, as I said, it's from around 2016, finance started focusing on. I think Venezuela was a big shock to China, how much they owe that, and it's basically going bankrupt, and they've had to renegotiate and forgive. BRI was not conceived as an aid program. They're supposed to make a profit or at least get paid back out of it. And yet, in fact, they're providing loans to a lot of countries with high risk factors involved, and finance is very worried about it and has really imposed a lot more reporting requirements now. And in fact, I think there were articles about it that a lot of the infrastructure spending sort of dropped off the cliff at the beginning of the year. So there seems to be a recalibration going on with that too. Open procurement, the foreign investment law they passed again, should open in China to foreign invested enterprises. Overseas, people have been encouraging China to join the WTO government procurement agreement. They just submitted their 6th revised offer, which they claim is much better. We'll see. There's a meeting early December to take a look at it. But if they did join it, at least it would establish a basis for more non-discrimination and opening it up. And China's begun to talk about opening procurement more to other companies, particularly with the initial design aspect rather than actual construction. Transparency, I haven't seen much at all. I mean, again, at home they're doing this. Why don't they do it overseas? When it comes to foreign affairs, information is considered almost like a state secret at home. And for some reason, to me, this would be low-hanging fruit. Make those MOUs public. Make all the project contracts be public, establish a database, but they don't want to do it. NDRC, I spoke to folks there, they're tracking a lot of information, and a lot of people wanted to set up a BRI database, but there's been a reluctance to do it. And it may well be because there's simply no standards. How would you pick who goes in there and what's going on? Again, stakeholder participation, no new national policies too. We're hearing that the policy banks, China Exim, China Development Bank, are thinking about, and in fact, Exim Bank has somewhat improved their own ESS policies for environmental social safeguards. China Development Bank has been working with UN Development, UNDP. They just came out with a big report they did with a joint investigation of environmental and social stuff around the world, but no real progress yet on that. But interestingly, in terms of stakeholder participation, I found there's a new development of a lot of Chinese NGOs who've got a lot of experience working with local communities at home, who are now also going overseas and working with local communities in Southeast Asia, Africa, et cetera, to help deal with Chinese companies in the area there. Corruption, I mentioned the Clean Silk Road Initiative. It's led by the party. And interestingly, if you get the party involved, maybe something will happen. So the party is talking about stationing party discipline inspectors in projects overseas, or at least having them go and do inspections from time to time. They are getting involved in training enterprises that are overseas on anti-corruption mechanisms, training people from BRI countries on anti-corruption mechanisms, et cetera, as well. But again, we come back with enforcement. How do you enforce all this? Even if China wants to do these, how is it going to get their companies overseas to actually start abiding by high-level principles? Again, they've increased reporting requirements not only on debt, risk, et cetera, but otherwise, the companies overseas are supposed to start reporting back the problems that they're running into overseas or that they are creating overseas as well. So MOFCOM and others can get a handle on it. I'll talk more about this later if you want. But very interesting development for those of you who heard about this social credit system developing China. They're now applying that to overseas activity as well. So this may actually end up being a more effective way. If you screw up overseas and it creates a problem and it gets reported back, you could get listed now in the social credit blacklist and have, be debarred from future projects, at least for a time being, and have a whole lot of other consequences as well, although we've had no reports on how that's working. So, concluding thoughts, it seems if China wants to try and get control of this big mess they've got overseas, they really need to start setting some standards for what qualifies as a BRI project. And I thought of it as sort of, the Better Business Bureau logo or whatever. You agree to certain commitments, you can get into the database, you're being transparent, every project you do, you insist to your partners that, you have to be, have public participation, et cetera, et cetera. But also the Chinese government, whoever, it's the state council, whoever's in charge of the policy banks needs to tell them they've got to start living up to these international standards. So make projects more open, transparent, et cetera, et cetera. And again, all of these things. They're really, BRI, we have a great need for infrastructure. BRI can deliver a lot of that. China's also talking now increasingly of multilateralizing, which has always been part of it. And again, at the recent forum, they talk even more about bringing in private sector financing as well as collaborating more with multilateral development banks. As China's economy slows, they're running out of money to some extent. Maybe this will actually start happening. And they can do what AIIB did, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is not a BRI bank, of course. But as it started doing new projects, it cooperated with the World Bank and other MDBs. And not only did that allow them to learn, but they could piggyback on the expertise of the personnel that these multilateral development banks have. And so maybe China Policy and Exim Bank could do the same thing because, if you're going to put in place these higher standards, you have to have a way to enforce them overseas as well. So I'll stop there. I end with a nice thing. If they could only establish some good standards and find out a way to effectively enforce them overseas, we really would be seeing a win-win situation for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our two panelists, Jamie Horsley and Scott Morris. Now is a portion of the evening where we open up for Q&A from the audience. We'll start right over here.
I have a question for the first panelist. Since BRI and AIB also includes many European countries, do you think the West European countries should step up into the diversifying the BRI in the developing countries, their debt source, and check the Chinese ability to use the debt as a geopolitical leverage?
Okay, and we'll take one more question right there in the back.
Hi, my name is Alex Hammer from the U.S. International Trade Commission. I actually have two questions, one for Scott, one for Jamie. Scott, you talked about some of the hidden lending China's providing for BRI, and you have it well documented. I was wondering if that hidden lending is a definitional issue, whether it's just because the lending doesn't meet some of the OECD standards, or whether there's like an intentional element to this to hide it, and who's providing that. And for Jamie, about the transparency issue with BRI. And trying to understand some basic things I'm a researcher. I've been looking into these things. Just some basic stylized facts, like how many countries are involved, is extraordinarily complicated just to get that. And then I'm just wondering, do you think that China has an incentive to make the BRI information more transparent?
So we'll take one more question, and then we're opening it up here.
Sunil Sharma from IIEP. Given what you've just described of the BRI and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, it seems to me that what determines whether a particular project is done either through the IIB or through the BRI? I mean, if countries had a choice, wouldn't they go for a more a transparent project through the AIIB rather than through the BRI? It's not clear to me, what the choice set is there.
So 3 categories of questions. 1, geopolitics of debt. 2nd, hidden debt and transparency. And the 3rd, which format do you choose, multilateral or bilateral?
Do you want to start with the debt
All right.
thing? Okay, and then I'll.
So I think if I understood the first question, it gets to a point Jamie was making. Basically, if you have these other countries participating who could be creditors, shouldn't they step up? I think that's how I understood it. I mean, so whether it's the Europeans or multilaterals, and I think it's a problem on the Chinese side and on the side of these other countries and institutions, that it remains the case that Belt and Road, as Jamie well described it, is not at a place yet where other creditors are going to be willing to attach themselves. And I think the procurement issue is at the center of all of that, probably more than anything else. These other certainly bilaterals, there's just no way, why would they provide ultimately money, underpinned by their own taxpayers to support projects that can only go to Chinese firms? I mean, that's just nonsensical. And the multilaterals have a bit of the same problem. For them, it's much more of a principles issue, is that they've defined sort of open procurement processes, and they're not going to, if they were to do any co-financing with, say, the Chinese policy banks, it will be under their standards and rules. So that's where the problem on the Chinese side arises, is that I don't know that these banks are yet willing to follow the, say, World Bank procurement standards even for a single project. I think that still remains to be a question. On hidden lending, yeah, I mean, I think for the purpose of that paper, they were trying to be a little provocative with that word. I think, though, it's not, again, there's an expectation that creditors, and let's keep in mind, China is the 3rd largest shareholder in the World Bank, 3rd largest in the IMF, I think that's right. There's an expectation that the members of those institutions, borrowers report their borrowing and creditors report their credits. So if they are not reporting, then it's fair to say that this is hidden. And then on choice of creditor, AIIB, it's not so obvious to me that in every case a borrowing country wants a higher standard approach. I alluded in my talk to a perception that sometimes all these things are onerous. If there's a more expedient way to access the money and pursue the project, I suspect that a lot of governments, maybe not the citizens, but the governments would rather pursue that path. I think for AIB, it continues to face a near-term challenge, is that it's still a new institution. It has a it's still staff of around 200 people. They're not going to be highly visible in every market overnight. It's going to take a long time for them to be lending at higher rates.
So I'll start with this question too, that, so I was involved with the Asia Society, did a study of BRI in Southeast Asia and came out with a report and 12 recommendations and all that. And we went to 4 different countries. And what we heard there and what I think is really going on is that actually BRI is not very top-down driven. Really, the time the center gets involved is just prior to these BRI forums, of which they've had 2. And then, they scurry around for a year before to try and line up projects they can list and agreements they can make. But what seems to have happened is really a lot of it. So a lot of these Chinese companies are all overseas already, and they're scrounging for projects, and they put together projects, and they take it to the local government, and they try to sell it to them. And then says, well, we can get financing as a BRI project, because the financing is really tightened up for projects. But if it's BRI, boom, then they take it up to CDB, or maybe China Exim for a portion, and then sell it to them. And so it's very entrepreneurial. And so you get a lot of garbage in and garbage out, so to speak, because, you know, again, it's no standards and nothing sense. So that's why, and I think AIB makes sure it's not, you know, BRI Bank per se, right? And most of their loans is to India so far, so, and better developed countries. So it's not clear they'd want to get involved in some of these projects. And on the transparency, what are China's incentives to be more transparent? Again, at this point, there is so much suspicion and so much criticism of the BRI. It seems to me China, by being more transparent, could help, number one, show that they actually have some good projects. I mean, one of the things that's happening in the environmental area is that over the last several years, they have increased the percentage of wind and solar projects they're funding, at least brought it up to the same ratio that China has domestically, which is still 6-to-1 coal to, you know, renewables, but it's slightly, you know, it's having an impact there too. So if the projects were more transparent, number one, it would increase trust. If it's not transparent, you figure you've got something to hide. So what are they hiding? And there's some bad stuff out there, but they're also good projects. I mean, you talk to a lot of these countries, they're happy to have, you know, the investment that's there. So that's one incentive. And the other one is just, as I said, because China's made it a signature project. And having a big OPIC project that just, you know, constantly subject to criticism is not good for China. But beyond that, it is, I mean, and the countries should want things to be transparent, except that right now a lot of the less developed countries where there's a lot of corruption still. They may be pushing that they don't want things transparent either. But again, that's why I think China should build soft infrastructure as well as hard, and that includes working with countries to introduce all these mechanisms and what the benefits are for them, including transparency, participation, et cetera, and publicize that to the world. But yeah, it's a hard sell, and so I'm still waiting to see when this transparency is going to come out.
So we have time for another round of questions right here in the front.
Thank you very much. It's been fascinating. I just wanted to get an idea of your sense of what the China military establishment role may be in some of these project fundings, to the extent that they might enhance road access or even port access, or some of these nuclear power plant developments as well. I'm sure it's hard to discern anything like that from the, quote, transparency perspective, but just to get a sense of that.
Okay, and Danny?
Hi, I'm Danny Leipziger. Thanks very much for both very good presentations. I guess my questions are a little bit more to Scott. The first has to do with debt relief. I mean, there have been 2 rounds, HIPIC and MDRI, and I think we can expect, you know, there are going to be some debt problems. You said that Chinese tend to deal with it themselves, but there's sort of a collective action kind of problem, and I think we saw it in Pakistan where the U.S. supposedly was opposed to the IMF program because it was going to bail out Chinese firms. So I wonder if you have a view on that. And then the second, since you came from Treasury, I'm amazed sometimes to hear Chinese officials say that they work very closely with the World Bank to make sure that the development gains of these projects are quite broad and deep and wonderful. And the World Bank never disputes that. And so now they have a new president. Will he dispute that? Because it seems to me most of these projects are done, as you said, even without central administration. Everyone goes out entrepreneurially and does it, but certainly not multilateral oversight.
And we'll take one more.
Hi, David Martin. I'm a student here at GW. My question goes back to something that Ms. Horsley mentioned, where there's this problem of not even having a definition from the Chinese side of what a BRI project is. Outside of internal Chinese definition, is there any sort of consensus or streams of thought from analysts or researchers on categorizing what is and is not a BRI project?
Okay, so in summary, we have what's the role of the military and Chinese military in this lending, multilateral oversight, as well as debt workout, and then how do we categorize what is a BRI loan?
So I think I'm just answering Danny's question, although I do want to, on the military thing, it just, what comes to mind for me, I think we have to acknowledge is, so as a Treasury official, I would spend a lot of time going to the U.S. Congress pleading with them to fund our request for World Bank money, the money the U.S. was going to give to the World Bank. One of my key talking points was, the World Bank is active in these countries where we have troops on the ground, they are building the roads that allow, so, let's be honest about how we ourselves, even with multilateral institutions, think about sort of the intersection of military and infrastructure and all that. Yeah, I just, on the debt relief question and sort of a new HIPIC, I actually just wrote a short piece on this last week and that argues that we won't see a new HIPIC because the constellation of creditors is so different, even official creditors with China dominant. There's no incentive for the Paris Club members who's, they don't have that much anymore, but certainly it's just very hard to have China not, there's just this longstanding question of will they join the Paris Club? I think we're past that point in a sense that, they have more outstanding lending than all Paris Club members combined. Why should they bother? But it does create a real dilemma, whether it's for the low-income countries that are facing debt distress where you're talking about, maybe not just restructuring, but actually having to allocate real money and grant money to this, and that's just a heavy lift. If you look at the experience with China on this, it is mostly my reading is mostly restructuring, not outright debt forgiveness. So there again, that's not very HIPIC-like. So I'm skeptical about that, except that I do think ultimately it has to drive China more toward coordination because there are so many of these cases, and certainly the big cases where it's not going to be in their interest to act unilaterally when it comes to, the point of the Paris Club is not to give debt relief, it's to get repaid. And I think increasingly if China finds that the better way to ensure repayment is in coordination with other creditors, then we'll see more of that. But I don't imagine some big HIPIC initiative overnight. Is David Malpass going to take a more critical view on project quality under Belt and Road? I think the real issue here is, does the World Bank in particular continue to engage or not, and then how do they engage? I think, to be perfectly honest, under Jim Kim, I think they were much more in cheerleading mode without a lot of substance behind it in a way that troubled me. What followed from that, though, and I attribute that, frankly, to more of his speeches and statements, there was actually very serious analytical work that the bank did following that, and over the course of this past year, they've produced a lot of papers that I think are really good and actually offer a lot of criticism of the initiative. I think what I worry about with the David Malpass is that he chooses disengagement over engagement. To be a real critic, you have to be engaged, and I think that's where, and ultimately I'd like us to be at a place where the bank is co-financing projects with Chinese bilateral actors under a framework where it is the bank standards. That, to me, that's the goal. But we're not going to, it's hard enough on the Chinese side. We're not going to get there if the bank leadership itself decides that this is some new kind of Cold War and they need to be on the U.S. side.
Yeah, if I could just jump on World Bank too. The other thing is, you call it cheerleading, but yeah, they've done, I see them almost as helping support, pointing out the problems and what some of the solutions would be. A lot of the stuff I've talked about, the World Bank has written about in their reports in the transportation sector, et cetera, et cetera. They're also coordinating, cooperating with China on things like anti-corruption training and efforts too, and they don't advertise this. Occasionally there'll be a line here or there, and it's very hard to find out what they're really doing, but they've been involved on many levels with China, sort of in connection with BRI and more broadly, but that will really might have an impact on making it a better initiative. On the military question, it's very hard to know. Again, my impression, and again, having talked and looked at some of these projects in Southeast Asia, even some that involve port development, which you would think the military would be all over. Again, it was developed by people with even the Chinese embassy often doesn't know these projects are being developed. So the military may certainly come in after the fact to take advantage of it, but so far at least, and it may just be part of the opacity, I haven't seen them involved in either planning projects they want people to do or financing them directly. But interestingly, just in this last Communist Party meeting they had, the fourth plenum, they did mention, you know, continuing the Belt and Road. It was very interesting because there was a big emphasis in terms of on their footprint overseas and with the overseas investment is to protect the security of their projects and their people and their investment. And so part of what the military presence is about too, as China is global now, they want their military in these countries and available to help out as well too. So you do see that kind of stress coming out of this as well. And then the transparency issue. What did you ask again? I can't remember now. Definition, sorry. Well, it's transparency, yes. No, so all the studies of BRI, people make a ton of assumptions, and they'll tell you at the beginning, we don't have any data, and CSIS has done some great work too, but they often do work that spans way before BRI into another thing, or pick a transport or whatever. So all you could do is look at there were initial 60-some countries listed. You can look and see who are the 137 countries who signed MOUs, and some people have developed a definition of a BRI partner country. But not all of those, you know, not all of them were along the original Belt and Road, and then what is the project? What is a BRI project? It's just being in country enough or not? We really don't know yet, and I'm not even sure they do have a definition internally yet, because we know at the beginning, to show that this was taking off really quickly, they allowed a lot of existing projects that were not so great and had gotten in trouble into the fold and to call themselves BRI projects at the beginning so they could show that there was a lot of activity. So I'm not sure there really is one yet, but if I were them, I'd be thinking about, although maybe they figure it's almost too late by now, it's already been 6 years and there's a lot of projects out there.
So this has been a fun and very stimulating discussion. On behalf of the Institute for International Economic Policy, Director James Foster, who unfortunately couldn't be here at this moment, we'd like to thank all of our panelists as well as discussants and audience as well for excellent participation in a really fun conference today. Also want to thank both Maggie Chen as well as Kyle Renner and our cadre of fearless students and IIP staff that's helped organize this conference as well. And finally, should have you heard something today that you want to refresh your memory on, should you wonder what happened mid-afternoon when you had to step out, fear not. There is the IIEP YouTube channel that you can engage with on your own at home over the weekend. Thank you again, and have a great day.